My daughter said, "Mom, we've already found you a place. It's lovely. You'll have your own room and people to look after you. And honestly, keeping this house is just not realistic anymore." She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed until the words no longer sound like a decision someone made. She said it the way you tell a child there is no other option when there is, in fact, another option, and you simply prefer they not think of it. I didn't argue. I said I would think about it. I watched her drive away from my kitchen window, the same window I had stood at for 33 years watching things come and go, and I thought, she has already decided. The only question is whether I have. My name is Loretta Ann Fisk, and I have lived in this house since 1991. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you what I did about it. 33 years. My husband Edwin planted the dogwood tree in the front yard the spring we moved in because he said a house needs something living in front of it that isn't grass. Edwin died 4 years ago, quietly, in the way that careful and private men often die. And I have been here alone since then. Not unhappily alone, purposefully alone. There is a difference that people who have not chosen solitude sometimes cannot see. My daughter's name is Gwen. She is 44 years old, and she married a man named Todd 12 years ago, and together they have built a life that is organized around comfort and efficiency and the management of what they consider to be inconvenient variables. I love my daughter. I want to say that clearly and without qualification before I say anything else, because everything that follows is easier to understand if you hold that alongside it. I love her. And she looked at the house I have lived in for 33 years and she saw a liability. The house is mine, entirely mine. Edwin and I paid off the mortgage in 2009, and when he passed, I handled the estate properly, transferred everything through probate, and the deed has had only my name on it ever since. I am not a woman who leaves these things vague. Edwin used to say I had the instincts of an accountant and the stubbornness of a property line, which he meant as a compliment, and I took it as one. For the first year after Edwin passed, Gwen called every Sunday. She came for Christmas and brought Todd and the grandchildren and filled the house with the particular noise of a family that is visiting rather than living, which is a different kind of noise, and I was grateful for it. But somewhere in the second year, the Sunday calls began to shift in character. She started asking about the house the way you ask about a car you suspect is nearly done. How are things holding up? Is the roof still doing okay? You know maintenance on a place this size gets expensive, Mom. She didn't ask those things cruelly. That is important to understand. She asked them with the genuine concern of a woman who believes she is being responsible. Todd began coming on the visits more regularly toward the end of last year. He is a man who works in financial planning, which means he has developed the professional habit of looking at everything as an asset or a liability, and you can see him doing it, the slight pause, the measuring look. He stood in my living room in January and said that the real estate market in my area was, and I am quoting him precisely, genuinely exceptional right now, and that a lot of people in my position were taking advantage of it. I asked him what position he thought I was in. He smiled the smile of a man who has learned to smile when cornered and said he just meant my age and circumstances. The conversation I am about to tell you happened on a Tuesday in March. Gwen came alone that day, which was unusual enough that I noticed it before she was through the door. She sat at my kitchen table, the table where she had eaten breakfast every morning of her childhood, and she told me she and Todd had been looking into Sunrise Gardens, a senior living community 40 minutes from their house, and that they had actually spoken to someone there, and that there was a unit available, and that the timing was, she said, almost too good to pass up. She had a brochure. She put it on the table between us like evidence. I looked at the brochure. I looked at my daughter. I thought about Edwin's dogwood tree, which was just beginning to bud in the front yard, white flowers coming back the way they did every March without being reminded, and I said, very calmly, that I would think about it. She looked relieved, which told me everything I needed to know about how certain she already was. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The coffee went cold. I am not a woman who cries as a first response to things. Edwin used to say I processed grief the way a river processes rain, slowly, thoroughly, and without drama. That afternoon, I did not cry. I simply sat and let the weight of what had just happened settle into me and asked myself the three questions Edwin and I had always asked when something needed to be figured out. What is the situation? What do I know? What can I do? The situation was clear enough. My daughter and her husband had decided, or were deciding, that my house was more useful as a transaction than as my home. Sunrise Gardens was not being suggested because I was struggling. I cooked my own meals. I drove myself to the doctor. I had a standing Tuesday lunch with my neighbor Paulette, who was 78 and still taught piano lessons from her spare room, and neither of us had any trouble managing our own affairs. Sunrise Gardens was being suggested because the house had value, and the house's value was more accessible if I was not living in it. What did I know? I knew the house was entirely in my name. I knew Gwen had no legal authority to sell it, force a sale, or transfer my property in any way without my consent. I knew I had done nothing to grant her that authority. I also knew, and this was the part that kept me at the table long after the coffee had gone cold, that the suggestion of incompetence is a tool that people sometimes use against the elderly, and that I did not intend to be naive about that possibility. What could I do? More than Gwen understood. Considerably more. The next morning, I drove to the public library on Clement Street, which has been one of my favorite places in this town since Gwen was small, and we would come on Saturday mornings, and she would choose 3 books, and I would choose 3, and we would read them on the drive home. Or I would read and she would listen. I asked the librarian, a young man with very good posture and a patient manner, for materials on property law, estate planning, and elder law in this state. He found me a substantial stack without asking why. That is one of the reliable gifts of a good library. No one asks why. I spent 3.5 hours reading. I took notes in the small leather notebook I keep in my purse, which Edwin gave me the Christmas before he got sick, and which I have never been able to bring myself to replace. By the time I left, I understood several things I had not understood before, at least not in the specific and actionable way I needed to understand them. I also knew I needed more than information. I needed a person. I found her the old-fashioned way, through the phone book and then through the State Bar Association's referral line, cross-referencing until I had a name I felt confident about. Her name was Cecilia Marsh, and her listing said real estate, elder law, estate planning, and it said she had been practicing for 19 years, which is long enough to have seen most things and short enough to still find them interesting. I called from the library parking lot and made an appointment for that Thursday. I drove home. I made dinner. When Gwen called that evening to ask, gently, whether I had looked at the brochure again, I told her I was giving it serious thought and that Sunrise Gardens did look very pleasant. She sounded warm and grateful, in a way that made something in my chest ache quietly. She thanked me for being open-minded. I told her, of course, good night, and I hung up and sat in Edwin's chair, which is where I do my clearest thinking. And I thought, my darling girl, you have underestimated me. Not out of cruelty, out of habit. You have been looking at me since your father died and seeing someone who needs managing, and you have forgotten entirely who it was that managed everything before you were old enough to know what managing meant. Cecilia Marsh's office was on the 2nd floor of a building downtown that smelled like wood polish and old paper, and was exactly the kind of place that inspires confidence without trying to. She was in her early 50s, tall and precise, with a manner that was warm but not soft. She shook my hand and offered me coffee and sat across from me and listened the way a person listens when they are genuinely paying attention and not simply waiting for their turn. I told her everything. Edwin's death, the deed, Gwen's visits, Todd's comments about the market, the brochure on the table, the Tuesday conversation. I told her what I had read at the library and what I had concluded and what I was afraid of and what I intended to do about it. When I finished, she said, very simply, that I had come in better prepared than most people she saw who had been through this for months. Then she told me what my options were. She confirmed what I had already suspected about the deed. Gwen had no legal standing whatsoever. No authority to sell, no authority to compel, no authority to transfer. The entire arrangement she and Todd had been discussing was, legally, a conversation they were having about something that did not belong to them. But there was more available to me than simply saying no, Cecilia explained, and this was the part I had been hoping to hear. There were instruments that could protect the property not just now, but going forward. A revocable living trust that would keep the house in my control during my lifetime and specify exactly what happened to it after, on my terms and no one else's. She also mentioned something called a transfer on death deed, which was simpler and accomplished, something similar depending on what I wanted the outcome to be. And she mentioned one other thing, a provision she could build into the trust that would require her own secondary letter to any title company before any sale could be processed, which meant that even if I signed something under pressure or confusion, nothing could close without her separate confirmation. That last part, I told her, was exactly what I needed. We talked for nearly 2 hours. When I left, I had a follow-up appointment and a plan that was more complete and more solid than the one I had walked in with. I drove home through the March afternoon and thought about Edwin and what he would have made of all of this. He would have been angry, I think. In the quiet way, he was angry at things, and then he would have helped me think it through. And then he would have made tea and said, "Well, let's get on with it then." I got on with it then. I got on with it. The trust documents were filed on a Wednesday. The deed was transferred into the trust that same afternoon. From that point forward, my signature alone was not sufficient to complete a sale. Cecilia's secondary confirmation was also required. Gwen did not know any of this. Todd did not know. No one knew but Cecilia and me. 3 days after the filing, Gwen called and asked if she could come by Saturday with Todd. She said they had some paperwork they wanted to walk me through, just to make things simpler, she said, just to get everything organized. I said that sounded fine and I would put on coffee. Saturday morning, I was in the kitchen when they pulled into the driveway. I watched them come up the front walk, Todd with his leather folder and Gwen with a bakery box, an offering, and I noticed they were both dressed neatly, carefully, in the way you dress for something you have been preparing for. I unlocked the door and let them in and thanked Gwen for the pastries and put them on the counter and poured the coffee, and we sat down at my kitchen table. Edwin's table, the table that had been the setting for 33 years of ordinary mornings, and I waited to see what they had come to say. Todd went first, which told me something about how they had planned this, that he would carry the practical side and Gwen would carry the warmth. He told me they had been doing a lot of research and talking to some people, financial people, and they had come to believe that the cleanest and most sensible approach for tax purposes, for estate purposes, for my own protection, was a direct transfer of the property to them now, with what he called a life use agreement, meaning I could remain in the house, he said, for as long as I needed to. It would just no longer be in my name. A verbal agreement, he said, and he said it without flinching. Gwen put her hand over mine and said they only wanted to make sure I was protected. That was the word she used. Protected. I looked at my daughter's hand on mine. I looked at the leather folder Todd had placed on the table. I looked at the dogwood tree through the kitchen window, white flowers fully open now. Edwin's tree, still doing what it had always done without being asked. I said, "Todd, I appreciate you both coming. I understand what you're proposing, and my answer is no." The temperature in the room changed the way temperature changes when something that has been suspended is suddenly dropped. Todd's expression shifted first. He said, "Mom," and paused, and then said it again. "Mom, if you keep making decisions about the property without getting proper guidance, we're going to have concerns about whether you're in a position to be managing these things alone." There it was. I had been waiting for it. Not hoping for it. Waiting, which is different. I looked at him. I looked at my daughter, who did not contradict him, who looked instead at the table with the particular expression of a woman who has known something was coming and has not found a way to stop it. I said, "I have retained an attorney who specializes in elder law. I have had an independent cognitive assessment with documentation of full competency. I have already made my arrangements regarding the property. Any challenge to my legal standing will be met with that documentation, and I suggest you consult your own attorney before pursuing that direction." The silence in my kitchen was complete. Todd stared at me. Gwen looked up from the table. Neither of them said anything for what felt like a long time. I said, "I think we're done for today. I will always be happy to have you here as my family, but this conversation is finished." They left. Todd first and Gwen followed, and she paused at the door and looked at me with an expression I still have not entirely found the word for. Not anger. Something more like the look of a person who has just seen something they did not expect to exist. I locked the door. I stood in my hallway and listened to the car pull away. Then I called Cecilia and told her what had happened. She said, "Good. That means they know now. And now they'll have to decide who they want to be." I will not tell you I felt triumph in that moment. I felt something harder to name, a kind of grief with its feet on the ground, the grief of having been right about something you wished you had been wrong about. I made chamomile tea. I sat in Edwin's chair. I gave myself the rest of the afternoon to feel what needed to be felt, which was mostly sorrow, not for the house, not for the money, but for the version of my daughter I had been carrying in my mind, who it appeared had been slowly replaced by a woman I didn't fully recognize, and who had brought her husband to my kitchen table on a Saturday with a leather folder. The next morning I called my friend Paulette, who had known me for 16 years and who answered the phone the way she always does, directly and without ceremony. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is the greatest gift a friend can give when you are in the middle of something. And then she said, "Loretta, you already handled it. What do you need right now?" I said I needed to hear someone else say that it was real, and I had not imagined it. She said, "It was real. You didn't imagine it, and you were magnificent. It is extraordinary what the right words from the right person can do for your spine." Paulette also told me something useful. She had a friend who volunteered with a legal aid organization for older adults, and she offered to connect me, not because I needed more help at that point, but because she thought I might want to know the terrain more completely. I made the call. A woman named Adeline spoke with me for an hour and confirmed everything Cecilia had told me, and added that the cognitive assessment I had already arranged was precisely the kind of documentation that made challenges of competency nearly impossible to pursue. She had seen it work dozens of times. The challenge, she said, is almost always a bluff. It has power only if the person it's aimed at doesn't know that. I knew it now. 2 weeks passed. Cecilia and I finalized the trust documents completely. The remainder beneficiary was the public library system of this county, which I had been donating to quietly for 20 years, and which had given me everything I needed on this particular morning without asking a single question. There was also a small sum designated for the music program at the elementary school, where Edwin had coached Little League for 11 years, because Edwin believed that children deserve things that serve no practical purpose whatsoever and were therefore essential. And there was something for Paulette's church, whose food pantry I had been contributing to since the year Edwin got sick, and the people there brought us meals 3 nights a week without being asked, and never mentioned it afterward. Gwen was not removed from my will entirely. She remained, conditionally. The conditions were written into the trust in plain and specific language. Cecilia did not soften them at my request. On a Friday afternoon, 6 weeks after the conversation at the kitchen table, I signed the final documents in Cecilia's office. She signed the countersignature letter. Everything was filed and recorded and complete. I drove home through the April afternoon and stopped at the garden center on the way and bought 2 new perennials for the side bed that had gone bare over the winter, because the garden does not stop needing attention simply because other things are happening. And in my experience, keeping ordinary things going is one of the better ways to keep yourself going with them. I planted the perennials that evening in the last of the daylight, my hands in the dirt, Edwin's dogwood overhead, the neighborhood settling into its quiet evening sounds. The specific, unglamorous piece of a thing completed, Gwen called 11 days later. Not the careful, managed call of someone running an agenda. Her actual voice, smaller than usual, uncertain, in a way I had not heard since she was young and had made a mistake she didn't know how to name. She said she had been thinking. She said she and Todd had been talking, and that the talking had not been easy, and that she thought she owed me an apology. I listened to the whole of it without interrupting. She said she had been afraid, which I had not expected her to say, and I think surprised herself by saying it. Afraid of something happening to me and not being prepared. Afraid of losing me the way we had lost Edwin and feeling helpless again. She said the fear had gotten ahead of her judgment, and Todd had been practical in a way that felt like action, when action was what she needed, and she had let herself follow it further than she should have. I believed her. That is the truth. I am not a woman who disbelieves things simply because I am angry, and I was not precisely angry anymore. I had moved through angry sometime in the middle of the first week and come out the other side into something clearer and cooler. I said, I believe you, and I need you to understand that what you were afraid of doesn't give you authority over decisions that aren't yours to make. Fear is not a deed. It does not put your name on anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know, Mom. I know that now. I told her the house was protected and would remain so, and that she did not need to worry about logistics because the logistics were already handled and they did not involve her. I told her I wanted us to find a way back to each other that did not require me to make myself smaller to get there. I told her I was willing to try if she was. She said she was. Her voice cracked when she said it, just slightly, the way voices do when something that has been held tight finally releases. We talked for an hour. Nothing was fixed, but things were said that needed saying, and that is the beginning of something if both people mean it. Todd, I will leave to his own conscience. He has not called. That, too, is information. It is May now. The perennials I planted have taken hold. The dogwood has finished blooming and gone green, which is quieter but in its own way just as good. I have had coffee on the front porch 4 mornings this week, which I had been meaning to do for 2 years and kept finding reasons not to. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center on Thursday evenings, taught by a retired school teacher named Aveline, who has opinions about light that I find genuinely interesting and who laughs at her own jokes before she finishes telling them, which is a quality I have always found endearing. We have had coffee twice now after class. She may become, in time, one of the people I think of as mine. I called the library on Clement Street last week and spoke with the director about a planned giving program they are starting. A quiet conversation, practical and specific, the kind that leaves you feeling that something you care about will continue past you in the way it deserves. The young librarian who had helped me find the right books on that March morning was not in that day, but I left something for him at the desk. Not a note, just a small plant for the reference desk, because that department had given me what I needed without asking why, which is the best thing any institution can do for a person, and I wanted to mark it. Paulette and I had lunch on Tuesday the way we always do. We talked about her piano students and the novel she is reading and a documentary she thinks I should watch. We talked about Edwin, which we do sometimes, easily. The way you can talk about someone you loved when enough time has passed that the love is no longer sharp, but has become something steadier and more habitable. She said she was proud of me. I told her I was proud of myself, which is not something I say often, but which felt true and worth saying. The house is mine. It has always been mine. The kitchen is the same color it was when Edwin and I chose it together in 1994, a particular warm cream that took us 3 samples to get right, and the light in the morning still comes through the east window the way it always has. Catching the edge of the table at a certain angle that I have seen so many times, I stopped noticing it until this spring, when I started noticing everything again. Here is what I want to say before I finish. I do not think my daughter is a bad person. I think she is a person who got afraid and confused love with control, which is a mistake people make, and which can sometimes be unmade if they are willing to do the work. Whether she does that work is something only time will show. I am not waiting on it. I am living my life. If someone in your life has ever looked at the thing you have built and seen only what it could be worth without you in it, I hope you will remember that your name on a deed is not an accident. It is history. It is 33 years of a kitchen and a dogwood tree, and the particular creak of a floor you know by sound in the dark. Nobody gets to take that from you quietly. And you do not have to be loud to stop them. You just have to be awake and ready, and know that patience, properly used, is not the same thing as surrender. It never was. If this story meant something to you, I would love to know. Leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done or what you have been through that felt like this. Some of you know this kind of morning better than you would wish. I would like to hear from you. Thank you for being here and for listening all the way to the end.